Hello everyone. Welcome to the Brookline Booksmith's author event series. My name is Silas Weiner and I'm a member of the events team here at the Brookline Booksmith. If you're familiar with our store, welcome back. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. A few housekeeping notes, please keep your phones on silent. And if you haven't picked up or pre-ordered book, you can do so in the back after the event. There will be a Q&A, so save up some questions, and thank you for being a part of our community today. We are here tonight to celebrate the release of Elsewhere, and it is my pleasure to introduce author Alexis Schaitkin and moderator Nina MacLaughlin. Nina is a maker of many mediums. She worked for 9 years as a carpenter and may or may not carve spoons in her free time, and is of course also the author of Wake Siren, Ovid Resung, a retelling of Ovid's Metamorphosis, the book-length essay Summer Solstice, and the acclaimed memoir Hammerhead. She lives right across the river in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Welcome. Alexis Schaitkin, congratulations. The author of Saint X, a New York Times notable book of 2020, Alexis's debut novel was recently picked up for a series adaptation by Hulu. Very exciting. Alexis lives in the Berkshires with her husband and their 2 children, and it's through both her personal experiences captured in the many adorable photos she posts of her kids on Instagram and her written work, such as Vera's experiences in Elsewhere, that Alexis interrogates what it means to be a mother and how women attempt to negotiate and assert their identities in the midst of an all-consuming role of motherhood. In Elsewhere, Alexis conjures a community in which girls become wives, wives become mothers, and some of them quite simply disappear. And in the context of the recent ruling on Roe, I think it's important to acknowledge that this is very much a story defined by that same fundamental question of who gets to choose. Here to tell us more, Nina MacLaughlin and Alexis Schaitkin.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you guys for being here. Thank you, Silas, and the rest of the Booksmith. Alexis is going to start by reading us a couple chunks in the book.
So I'm going to read from 2 sections, one from early on and then a little bit later in the novel. And I think I'll just tell you as little as possible before diving in. As Silas said, this is a novel about a small community, very secluded, very isolated, where mothers every so often just kind of vanish into the clouds. And it's narrated by a girl named Vera. She's a teenager when the story starts, and she sort of takes the reader through her coming of age to marrying and then finally becoming a mother and facing this question for herself of, is she going to get to stay with her child or will she vanish? And the first section I'll read is from fairly early in the novel, and it's just Vera explaining a little bit about how this strange affliction operates. Our affliction was never not watching us. It saw us more clearly than we saw one another or even ourselves, so the clues preceding a mother's going could be the smallest things, so subtle they became visible to us only in retrospect, when her going cast its clarifying light onto her past. Nothing was too insignificant to be a sign. A mother let her children cross the Grabach on the rocks when the water was a little too high, the current a little too swift. At the time, it merely struck us as incautious, one of the countless small choices mothers made every day that could end in disaster, but didn't. This was not a judgment. If mothers were cautious all the time, children languished. We understood this. But after she went, we found ourselves returning to that moment. The small children, the slick rocks, water rushing all around, and the mother looking on calmly from the bank. It appeared differently to us then, no longer the sort of act that any mother might commit, but a moment that contained the singularity of her love for her children, the quality, individual to her as a fingerprint, by which our affliction had chosen her out. Another mother refused to let anyone watch her infant for even a few minutes so she could bathe or do the shopping, not her sister or her mother or even her husband. She trusted no one but herself. She had always been tightly wound, and we had accepted this behavior as the inevitable and not altogether uncommon result of applying such a temperament to new motherhood. But after she went, we saw clearly the inimitable nature of her mothering, how her love had curdled into obsession. One mother abandoned her impeccable garden after her child was born. She let the forest reclaim the beds of sweet pea and foxglove, allowed weeds to suffocate the rambling rows along the fence line. Another, who had never shown much diligence about anything before she became a mother, plunged herself into her basket weaving. She kept her child in his swing on the porch for hours while she wove, left the task of soothing him to the breeze instead of rocking him in her arms. One mother was seen yanking her daughter's braids for a minor offense. Another remained eerily calm when her child spit in her face. What connected these mothers? Their clues pointed in different directions, indicating recklessness and vigilance, insufficiencies and excesses of love, love sublimated, love coarsened, love sweetened to rot. The signs preceding a mother's going were individual to her. They did not add up to something so crude as criteria, as a lesson or a rule. But once a mother went, we saw it. Something out of balance in the nature of her love for her children that set her apart. Had she fallen out of balance on her own, and had her fall drawn the affliction to her? Or was she born afflicted, and all along, through her girlhood and her adolescence, her marriage and her pregnancies, and, as long as it lasted, her motherhood, had she carried it inside her, and had it worked upon her until there was nothing in her that was not touched by it? We couldn't say. We knew only that she was no longer meant to be here, that we were not meant to have her, keep her, and her going was the proof of this. Her absence left a cavity, a wound, as if our affliction had opened us to perform a necessary extraction. But like any wound, it healed. For a time, we could still see the traces of it, still feel the tenderness in the places where she used to be. But soon enough, a day came when we probed for the spot, and we discovered that we could no longer find it, or even remember how it had felt. Now I'm going to read another little part from much later in the novel. So, this is a section after, where does it start? There it is, okay. This is a section from after Vera has she's grown up, she's married, and her daughter Iris is 5 years old. And I think that's really all you need to know. We lived happily. In no time at all, Peter and I were making arrangements for Iris's 5th birthday party. Tea at the Alpina was no longer in fashion. It would be a backyard affair with crafts and a scavenger hunt and a contest where children clasped their hands behind their backs and ate sugar donuts hung from our clothesline with licorice laces. We had special ordered everything months in advance. There would be purple balloons and vases of yellow bell. For lunch, meat pies and cucumbers cut in coins, not sticks, and jelly sandwiches made triple-decker and sliced thinly to reveal their red stripes. Peter and I were merely the executors of this vision, which was Iris's from top to bottom. She had grown into a child at once dreamy and resolute, with fierce preferences about the sorts of things other children didn't even notice. By the time she was 3 years old, she'd begun trying to choose my clothes for me in the mornings because my trousers and blouses distressed her so. She'd go into my bureau, pull out dresses or skirts, anything floral or with lace, and beg me to put them on, to wear pretty clothes like Sally. Iris adored Sally and was always sneaking across the street to see her. She loved her pastel garments, her ruffles and her rouge and her curls. She was too young to discern the desperation in these things or the spoilage. Sally, in turn, was so flattered by Iris's affection that she showered her with treats and gifts. Iris knew any time she popped across the street, there would be some sweet or trinket waiting for her, shortbread or an old necklace of Sally's or a silk flower. It's strange to think now that when I was pregnant with Iris, and in her early months, her particulars seemed to suggest nearly infinite possibilities for who she might become. They were clues to a temperament, but they might mean this or that. You could read them any which way. Her constant squirming, for example, could portend physical prowess or volatility or an aimless soul. But by then, it was possible to draw a straight line from those early clues to this girl, deliberating over the best shade of purple for the balloons at her party, whether lilac or lavender or mauve, and hiding out beneath the kitchen table to scribble a list for the scavenger hunt. Feather, lizard, mushroom, and, mysteriously, wing. Even that phrase, pregnant with Iris, indicates the shift of mind I experienced, the inevitability that gathers around a child like an aura as they grow, as if, even while I carried her inside me, she was already and only could have been our Iris. How sweet those years when Peter and I watched her reveal herself. Every day, new delights, new surprises. She was such an intent child, so singular in her focus and attentions. For weeks as a toddler, she would only let us read one book to her at bedtime, over and over. No other book would do. She would gum the chosen book, suck and gnaw it until the cardboard pages frayed to reveal their layers. We went through an especially intense period with a book about a rabbit family, which she called simply Bunny. She needed it 4-5 times through before she could release herself to sleep. Peter and I always tucked her in together. We never wanted to miss it. Iris in her jammies, furiously rubbing her eyes to ward off sleep, crying, "More Bunny, more Bunny." Together in our bed, when she was finally asleep, Peter and I said it to each other. More Bunny. It became a code, an invitation, a statement of desire. More Bunny, and we were on one another, sucking and gnawing as Iris mouthed her beloved books. Our sex giddier than it had been before Iris, fueled by our delight in her, in what we had made together, and in ourselves, this family. Next thing we knew, it was morning, and we woke to Iris calling her deliberative order from her crib. "Mama, come get you." Always Mama. Iris was never not touching me, idly stroking me, squeezing, scratching at my skin, as if discovering her own body. While Peter tended to the teeth of the town, Iris and I spent days that seemed weeks long. For days on end when she was 3 years old, she wanted to do nothing but stalk our backyard, staring up into the trees. "I'm looking for the owl," she would tell me, as if this should have been evident. When I tried to coax her inside for lunch or nap, she grew stern with me. "Mama, you wait. I didn't find my owl yet." She had learned about owls in a book of birds, one of Sally's gifts. I explained that we had no owls here. They lived in places far away, but this only sent her into a rage. "You don't have owls, Mama," she shouted and stomped her feet. I told her we should be glad we didn't have owls. They were vicious creatures. They steal the eggs of other birds from nests and gobble them up. I didn't know if this was true. Regardless, she was unafraid and unconsoled. "The eggs are baby birds," I elaborated, but this, too, had no effect. I told her dark things. I wanted to know the edges of her, what would make her afraid. I told her that wolves ate rabbits, that when people grew old, they died and became bone. "Okay, Mama," she said reassuringly, as if I were seeking comfort from her in the face of these truths. I told her about the seagull, how the children shot it down and we drowned the bloody bird in the Grabach. "Seagulls live by the sea and eagles live by the Eeg," she said. I took her fishing in the Grabach. It had rained in the night, sending worms writhing up out of the ground, and we plucked them steaming from the dirt and ran them through with our slender hooks. When Iris's rod curved, she let me help her reel in her catch, then pushed me aside and crouched over the flopping fish in the grass. She stroked her hand back and forth against its scales, smooth one way, rough the other. She pressed a fingertip to its lidless eye. Before I became a mother, I thought young children were afraid of everything. I hadn't realized there was a time before fear, when children are not afraid of the dark or death or beasts eating each other alive. Iris loved to poke at my torso, to press against the skin and feel it move over the ribs beneath and say, "There's bones inside." Between Peter and Iris, it was different. After work, he played with her while I fixed dinner. They colored and had tea parties and ran races across the yard. He delighted her with his jokes, calling an apple a banana a bandana, searching high and low for the hat on his head. They never found themselves in the convoluted tangles that were the bread and butter of our days together. If I was in the bathroom with Iris at bedtime, pleading with her to brush her teeth, Peter had only to pop his head in and say, "Are you refusing to brush your nose?" And she laughed like it was the funniest thing she'd ever heard, then squeezed the paste onto the brush. One afternoon, Peter and Iris were playing fairies in our yard while I wove on the porch. Suddenly, Iris let out a cry and clutched her hand. At her feet, a bee limped through the wet grass. Peter tried to gather her in his arms, but she broke free of him and ran sobbing across the yard and up the porch steps to me. She climbed into my lap, and I rocked her and told her soon the pain would fade. I looked across the yard at Peter. I could see the hurt in his eyes, and I wanted to wish that Iris had let him soothe her, but I couldn't make myself wish it. I wanted to wish she were not in pain, but I couldn't do that either because the pleasure of soothing it went so deep. I thought that I should want what Peter and Iris had, a simpler, less turbulent love, parent and child, instead of the two-bodied creature Iris and I became together. But I could not make myself want it. I couldn't get enough of our push and pull, the spell we cast upon one another, our love like a secret chamber we shared, and always, no matter where we were or what we were doing, we were also there in that chamber together. I loved to love her this way, even as I worried that this love might not be what a child needs, that it might also be a kind of harm.
Excellent, Alexis. Thank you. That was incredible. And that's a good way to start. This is sort of a perfect entry into my first question. In that first chunk, you write about mothers who pay more attention to their basket making or don't react to the child spitting their face the correct way. And it doesn't. You say it's not judgment, but there's this kind of question, and it's spoken to in that second part too that you just read. Is this what the child needs? Is this harm? Like the sort of frightening kind of current that runs through it, to my mind, was that, like, is there a wrong way to love, and is there a right way to love? And I wonder if you would speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think thank you so much for that question. 'Cause it's like, I think that kind of gets really at the heart of one of the things I wanted to explore so much in this book is really just the way that question can be so corrosive in the mind of somebody trying to love somebody. And I think that question and a lot of the book operates on kind of a societal level and then also at an individual level, and you kind of see it having different ramifications, right? The society is convinced that there are right and wrong ways to love, right? That when a woman disappears, when the affliction kind of chooses a woman, it is because of something she did. Now, it's always something they decide on in retrospect, right? So there's no safety, there's no right way to love in the present, because if a woman vanishes, everyone will look back and kind of tear apart everything she's ever done and say, oh, it's this. It's, she forgot to send her kids lunch to school a few days. She was obviously a very distracted mother or something like that. But right, so the kind of the way in which, as a society, I think we kind of impose these incredible judgments and scrutinies and surveillance upon like the way mothers in particular relate to and raise their children. But then there's this kind of self-surveillance that happens that's related but also different, right? Like I think the mothers in this town, because of the affliction and because of that societal pressure, especially, feel this kind of pressing in on them from other people. But I think they also all feel it kind of in themselves, and I think we all feel it. And that's not just about motherhood. That's about any really intense, powerful relationship we have with somebody else, with which I think one of the things that fascinates me is how idiosyncratic those relationships are, right? They're like fingerprints, like, and this novel is set in kind of this weird town that nobody elsewhere can understand, and I think our deepest relationships are kind of like that, right? It has the it's like this little landscape, and you share it with one other person, and nobody else understands what's going on between you, and that's really beautiful. But I mean, I don't know, I think maybe it depends on everybody's experiences, but like, I feel like we're always kind of harming people in the same moment that we love them, right? Because there's something, it's not necessarily that it's selfishness, right? But whenever something is so particular, I just feel like it has these seeds of something hurtful, even as it can be really loving, and that kind of balance and that dance is just really interesting to me.
Totally, and how to detangle them in any moment.
Or
and
like
can they get
yeah,
right.
Right.
Another, I mean, this is interesting too, this idea, like, both your first novel took place on a Caribbean island, and this is takes place in this sort of remote, almost fairy tale-ish village, but both places are separate, you know, that there is sort of away from the mainland, so to speak. And there is this idea, I feel like that was so present, and both, it seems like, this idea of sort of insider versus outsider. It's very apparent who belongs and who doesn't belong. And I feel like, I mean, I would love to hear more about that from you. I mean, that sort of hinges on what you were saying about sort of, you know, you have this kind of little bubble within any sort of kind of intense, close relationship. And then there's this sort of wider insider-outsider dynamic too at play in a really forceful way here.
Yeah, you know, I think, you know, the insider-outsider thing, well, I mean, I think one thing that also connects both novels and that maybe connects to this insider outsider thing is, you know, both of these kind of removed island or bubble settings have something kind of dark that has happened there that all of these people have to you know, kind of reckon with, and I guess I'm always really interested in like how much of who we are is just kind of like the cultural influence of where we've come from and what we've known and like what formed us, what place formed us. And so you know, in St. X it's a little different because it's a fair amount of it is about outsiders kind of on the island, but you know, for the characters in that novel who are kind of like local to the island, and for these characters here, I think there's this question of, you know, for Vera, there's, I think, really a question of like, how much can you know like who you are when you are so much a product of this very intense, very particular world and experience. And I feel like we all kind of, in our own ways, right, come from a little island, whether that's like your family that raised you or an actual physical place that you know, grew up in and then, you know, left and went somewhere else. But kind of reckoning with that question of sort of, like, how much of who I am is this place, and how much potential do I have to become somebody else, and yeah, and I mean, I think for the people in this town, there is this sense of like a sense that this affliction, you know, it's really dark, and so one of the things that I was interested in is like, well, why did they stay here? And that was like a place that's really dark and where something terrible happens and people stay. And the way that becomes kind of pride for these people, and a sense of like, we here experience something that nobody else does. And I don't know, the way kind of communal darkness can like just become this part of a group identity that's so hard to kind of take out, even if you know it's kind of rotten.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So I read like a day or two ago something that along the lines of if the dog that you kick every time you're near it is going to be a completely different dog than the one you give a treat to every time you're near it, and like a different actual creature. And I was thinking about it in relation to this and the sort of, you know, how darkness, and I like that you're using the word darkness and not trauma. I think that feels like a more right word. Like, it's a darkness, and how it can sort of, as you say, sort of define an identity, both in an individual and in community-wide. And one of the ways that they deal with it in this book is to really ritualize once a mother disappears, there's this whole elaborate, or not elaborate, but these very, like, this real set of
I
rituals.
think we can say it's
Yeah,
fairly
okay, yeah,
elaborate.
And I wonder, I guess, what I'm wondering is it an argument, I guess do you feel like there's a way that we can sort of see ourselves out of darkness? That there's something to be gained or learned from experiencing these sorts of things?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the people in this community really believe that there is, and their belief really is that, by living with something so terrible kind of hovering over their community, right? The possibility that any morning you're going to wake up and somebody's mother, somebody's, spouse is just going to be gone, that living with that gives them access to like a much deeper, richer, wilder life experience. And one thing that was really important to me in this novel was, obviously this community is in some ways sort of dystopian, it's pretty broken, but I didn't want to totally dismiss that as like a completely deluded cult belief. Because I think that, right, like I wanted to take seriously what Vera and these other people believe they're experiencing, because I don't think it's totally crazy, you know? And I think, for me, that's why something really dark like that was so interesting, because it's not, it isn't obviously all bad. Like, there are things that really, I'll say traumatic experiences give us, right? And there is a sense of kind of revelation of identity, and I think one of the real questions that is definitely not answered in the book, but that I'm kind of interested in like rendering, I guess, is just when something really big happens to you, whether it's becoming a mother or watching somebody disappear or something that's transformative, how do you figure out whether you're finding or losing yourself?
Yeah, that's one of the things that comes up sort of repeatedly is this idea of your truest self. And there's different ways that the characters sort of access that and see it accessed in other people, sort of through motherhood, through music. And I guess what I'm curious to know is whether you think there is a truest self.
I mean, I don't think I have an answer to it, and I think it's one of the things that I have had like a kind of lifelong preoccupation with, which is why I do think it shows up in St. X and in this, Alice, in the teenager in St. X, is kind of on a mission to sort of push out of her bubble and find herself, and there's a lot of characters in that book who want to throw themselves into some kind of dangerous, intense experience with the idea that it will reveal something to them about themselves, and I think there is a similar kind of thematic thing going on here of a sort of communal belief, right, that experiencing something really intense helps you unveil something. I don't know. But I think one of the things that I'm interested in is like just the unanswerability of that question, and like we all have to go through life not knowing the answer to that. I think it seems really like one of those questions you need an answer to, even if you don't know what that self is, like whether there is one, and are you trying to find it, and is that like one of the points of being here? But I feel like I don't know the answer to that, and I think it's always interesting to me with this book that these characters are really convinced that a woman needs to become a mother to reveal that truest self to herself, that until you've kind of submitted to something this all-encompassing, you really don't know who you are, and that a woman can become a mother and realize she's really different than she thought she was. But I hope, even though Vera, our narrator, has sort of drunk the Kool-Aid of this place and doesn't say it, I hope the reader can kind of see around her to this sort of opposite that she never addresses of kind of, the other choice, the choice to not become a mother and to kind of, live a life that is all, for yourself or for others who are not children, has the potential to reveal other things that,
Sure.
So I guess the answer is I don't
Yeah, yeah.
know, and I think about it a lot,
Yeah,
and that's
yeah.
why I write about it a
Cool,
lot.
that's good. And another thing I love throughout is the sort of the description of the natural world. Like there's something so sensual about your descriptions. And there's this great thing called skin fruit, which is this fruit that the mothers particularly eat, and weave baskets out of the vines from it. And so I want to talk a little bit about boundaries and biting into the skin fruit, and the way that men and women have sex is that women keep a little silver pin in their hair, in their braids, and when they're having sex, they puncture their husband's skin and suck some of their blood. And both have this sort of cannibalistic vibe,
Yeah.
this sort of like absorbing the other.
Yeah.
And so I guess, I just want to hear what you have to say about sort of boundaries and the dissolution of boundaries, and, in these moments of like deep connection, is it a dissolving of boundaries? Is it sort of like the most pronounced boundaries? All of those sorts of
That's
questions.
a really great question, and it really makes me think of your book, Wake Siren. So Nina has written several books, but the one that I'm kind of halfway through and just loving right now is called Wake Siren, and it is these kind of retellings of Ovid's metamorphoses from the perspectives of the women in the stories, and they're all undergoing these transformations, and I feel like there's always this question of like, is this transformation empowering? Is it disempowering? Is it making her, is it a gain? Is it a loss? Is it making her more herself? Is it so and I think that all of these different ways in which the women in this book kind of take into themselves something that's not them is sort of exploring similar terrain. I sort of was envisioning these in two different ways at once, and one of which was this kind of like desperate act to tether yourself, that the woman herself and the woman's body is vulnerable, like faces this totally existential threat, like the woman's body could just vanish, and maybe if my body holds some of your body in it, or if it holds some of like the fruit of this place in it, maybe that's anchoring me, like. And so it has a little bit of this sense of like the woman's body is not safe or trustworthy on its own, and it needs these other things in it to keep it in place. But it does also have this sort of like ecstatic communing with the other, and like becoming more than yourself quality to it, for sure.
Yeah. Definitely, both come across, totally. Oh shoot, I was just gonna say, oh no. Oh man, it was hinging just on what you said.
Ecstatic.
I'll come back to it. I guess one of the things too, there's this sort of enchanted and enchanting feel to this, like sort of, as I used the word fairy tale before, I don't know if that's quite right, but there's this kind of, and again, magic isn't quite right, but there's a dreaminess to it, and I would love to know sort of how, I guess almost in a process way, as you were writing, did you sort of get into this kind of trancy dream state? Is this sort of, did you have to sort of trick yourself into it? Did this come naturally? How did it sort of come out of you?
I think that the town and the vibe of the town is the thing I knew about the book before anything else. I mean, I'm very like nature. I live, and some of the people who are here know I live kind of in a small town, surrounded by woods, and I just I'm always very like place inspired in what I write, and I think often the first thing I know is kind of not even like the details of the setting, but how I want it to feel to the reader to read the book. You know what I mean? Like the energy, the atmosphere of the book. And so I think that came to me pretty easily. I did I did do something when I wrote this book, which I've never done before, but I know like other authors do, which is I listen to the same song every day when I sat down to write.
Can I ask what song?
Yeah, but I'm gonna completely mispronounce the composer's name. His last name is Smetana, and it's the Moldova,
Oh, yeah,
and it's from the Tree of Life movie, and it's from the soundtrack, and it's also kind of, I think, partly the inspiration for the Israeli national anthem in some way.
Wow.
But anyway, it's a very like dark, broody song, but also
yeah.
has this like magisterial feel, and there is a kind of Easter egg reference to it in the book. But
Awesome. That's
but
great.
yeah, you know, I think like when I started this book like a year before COVID began, but I was totally spinning my wheels, and I started to really understand what I was trying to do right around when, like March 2020, because my other book came out in February, and then I was like, all right, I'm ready. And you know, our son's school was closed for 6 months, and so I was, you know, it was kind of like, you know, I'm at my desk in the hallway, and he's with my husband, but they're running around, and so I think it was like very helpful to listen to that song and just kind of set a tone or a vibe. And then the other answer is, I did once stay at a guest house in a place that is sort of a loose inspiration for just the physical landscape, and it was just a place like kind of in the mountains where every afternoon the whole place just filled with clouds, and everything was just super damp, and so there was this, you know, everything was incredibly green and lush and vibrant, but also there was just this smell of like mildew and decay everywhere.
Cool. And there's such a striking moment where, I don't want to give anything away, but there's sort of a...
I know what you're talking about.
the sort of feeling of like, when you live in that environment, you don't smell the mildew, you don't smell the sort of like the rot. And that to arrive there is to sort of be blasted with this sort of fetid, like rotty grossness of it. I totally, I mean, this idea of a sort of a somatic trigger when you're writing, like sort of clicking your brain into place. Is it something, and this is my own curiosity, was it a song you would listen to repeatedly as you were working, or just like the one time?
One time. Yeah, I know that some people, do you listen to music while you write?
Sometimes, not often.
I find it impossible.
Sometimes,
like I'm just listening to I don't know. It's weird because I also work in really loud cafes, so you would think I would be able to listen to music, but I totally can't. So no, I would listen to it once and then start writing.
Cool.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, that's interesting. And so was the writing of this book? Did it feel different than the writing of your first book?
Yeah, and I think that was really intentional because I wanted to kind of set a different, like, not challenge, that sounds very basic.
Sounds legit.
But, you know, I think Saint X is sort of, it's set in our contemporary world, it's very social, you know, it's very much about, like, it was first of all very research heavy, but a lot of it is about, like, what's the perfect, you know, detail for, like, what drink would a 7-year-old in 1995 on a beach vacation order? Would it be a Sprite or an Orangina? You know, it's like, it was about kind of nailing those little details, and I was really interested in the idea of kind of building a world from scratch, and thinking, like, is there a way to make that world as full of details and to help the reader feel like those details are evocative for the reader, even though they're not actually part of your own life, if that makes sense.
Totally. I mean, yeah, because with skin fruit, for example, I was like, oh, of course, skin fruit.
By the end, right?
and truly, it was like, it just, to the point where I almost looked it up, you know, to see like, oh, what is this fruit that I have never heard of before in my life? So that's cool.
Yeah.
And this is a little bit, I mean, with the idea of St. X becoming a television show, how is, like, that is, I was about to say that must be exciting, but I don't know what that must be like.
Yeah, it's, I mean, I think it's very exciting.
Yeah,
It's obviously, I'm excited.
Awesome.
I'm not really involved in it, which I think is kind of perfect. It's filming right now.
Wow, amazing.
And I think it's almost done filming, and I get little, like, emails every day about what they're filming.
Wow.
But it's, you know, I think it's just, you know, really cool, first of all, because I don't know anything about making a television show, but just to feel like, okay, I wrote this book and everything I have to say about it is kind of in the book.
Yeah.
And then someone can take it and make something, that's going to be a little bit different.
Yeah.
So I'm really excited to watch it.
Yeah, I was saying to you in an email, reading Elsewhere was one of those books where I felt like I would finish reading a chunk of it and it would take me a few minutes to sort of land in the actual world, which I feel like that is a real feat of writing. I think to sort of really deposit a reader in the world that you're in. I mean, I don't know, that doesn't happen. And sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, I was just gonna say, like, thank you first of all, but I mean, one of the things I was really aware of in writing this book is, like, obviously it has resonances with kind of our contemporary world and our contemporary moment, but I was hoping to write something that had those resonances, but where the reader could just, like, really get lost in the story and not just keep thinking, well, I think this is a symbol for this and this corresponds to that. It was important to me that there weren't those kind of one-to-one really heavy correspondences, so that you could just kind of slip into a dream a little bit.
Yeah. You absolutely achieved that, because I mean, despite the resonances, and maybe it was a beautiful way to sort of experience at like one remove, or just even from an oblique angle, everything that's sort of going on.
I don't know, I feel like speculative fiction has that power of, like, it can be a commentary and an escape at the same time, and I think often we need both of those, so.
Definitely. And are there, and I get cagey about this question, do you have something you're working on now?
Yeah, I'm not cagey, I just don't have that much to say. Yeah, I am. I'm working on something. I'm in, like, the very early brainstorming, my favorite phase, right? Where I don't know what part. I mean, I'll ask you that next. But, like, my favorite part is where you're just kind of brainstorming, and there's a million directions the story can go, and so it feels like every day you have 10 great ideas instead of when you're actually writing the book. But it's a little bit historical. I feel like each book kind of on the surface seems really different, but it's also like a female narrator kind of looking back on some really, like, sort of dark and mysterious things that happened in her past and trying to reckon with them.
Cool.
Can I ask you that question of, like, oh my gosh, now I totally forgot what the question was.
About favorite parts of writing? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it sort of varies. I think when it's really on, and you're just kind of like in it, and sort of your brain is elsewhere. That is absolutely that sort of like, that sort of trance state. For me, it's like that feeling of like, wow, I don't actually even remember writing this. That is great.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's ever happened.
Oh yeah, it's rare. It's rare.
I'm trying to get there someday.
I feel like it's like a little bit like runner's high. Like you can go for 30 runs and then have like 18 seconds where you're like, oh my god, this is amazing, and you're always
don't feel tired at all. Just going.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so it's like, writing to have those like 5 minutes where it's just like, and right now I'm doing, I'm like deep in research for a project which I don't know what's going to happen with it, but it's just almost like there's a lot of cloud atmosphere, as Alexis was just saying, and I sort of feel like I'm in this sort of cloud of material and sort of just in this atmosphere and letting it just kind of sit on my skin, and hoping it solidifies at some point. I'm looking at the time, wondering if any of you guys have any questions for Alexis.
First of all, I did Google skin fruit because I also don't.
Oh really?
Oh, I've never Googled it. Okay.
Don't Google images. And my actual question is, so both of your books have this idea of, female disappearance, women disappearing. And I think it's kind of interesting, there's sort of like this juxtaposition of, in the first one, a woman disappears and everyone becomes too obsessed with it, and it kind of creates this like whole economy even. And in Elsewhere, women disappear and everyone forces one another to just move on. And so I guess I'm wondering if you're thinking about like what does the way that we mourn women say about us?
Wow, that's a great question, and I don't think I could have framed the connection between the two books that well. But I think you're totally right. Like there is for Allison in the first book, this just, she becomes just the center of a vortex, and that just swirls around her for decades and across countries. And here it's like, a mother disappears, and by that night, they've begun to kind of erase her from the record. And I think that both of those sort of, even though they're like opposite reactions, stem from these questions of sort of like blame and how we view women as kind of culpable in what happens to them. Because the St. Acts really swirls around this question of like, well, was she, it is very much a sort of like, what was she wearing? Who was she with? Like, why did she think this was safe? Was she, and so there is a lot of sort of speculation on kind of like how culpable, even as the lives of these other men who are suspects kind of are destroyed, there's a lot of kind of blame placed upon Allison, and kind of, she is totally picked apart for every choice that she made, every photo that she's in. And, I think that in Elsewhere, there is a little bit of connection, because the women are really, and once a woman disappears, the first thing that happens is that her entire past is kind of, picked apart by the other mothers for, oh, this is what she did wrong, oh, this is what she did wrong. And there's no mother who could disappear and they would just say, it's really surprising, like they would find something. It's a kind of like self-justifying loop. But then I think the erasure is, I think, also a kind of statement that what happened to her was the right thing to happen. That there was something in the very particular way that this woman loved her child that was out of balance, and therefore she just wasn't like what a mother should be. And so this kind of communal forgetting that happens, where they burn all the photographs of her, and then they kind of, the other women take her possessions and sort of almost treat them as if they've always been their own. And a few weeks later, nobody's ever speaking about her. I think has, in a similar way, like a sense of blame, of, the affliction chose this person for a reason, and therefore she's gone, and we're done with her.
Yeah.
Thank you, that was a great question.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I feel like the first part of the conversation was really, I was just thinking about nature versus nurture the entire time, I guess. And I think we talked about the nurture part a lot, but I'm just curious, like, how much you think, like, nature is involved, and I guess that gets at the truest self question.
Yeah.
But when you're reading, like, the one part about, like, Iris, and, like, the mom was like, I saw those tendencies in her, it was interesting because, like, I felt like you were giving more to nature at that moment, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, so I think the main way I can answer this is just by kind of like watching my own kids. I have a 5-year-old and a 10-month-old, and it's just fascinating to me. Like, I guess I think that like people are kind of, there's a community, right? Like there's like our environment, and obviously like the environment here shapes people, but there is this kind of, I don't know if I would call it like a true self, but just a kind of temperamental nature that I think people, right, are born with, and that is very specific, and that I think for me that wasn't really something I had thought about that much until I had kids, and I was like, whoa, like this doesn't come from anything that we do with you, but you for whatever reason, I'm trying to think of like an example, but I don't know, I was just like thinking about our son who's 5, and you know, the things that he gets nervous about. I'm like, we've never talked to you about this. Like, nobody's ever talked to you about this. You've just kind of decided you've got this whole narrative that's just yours on your own. And so, but I think that part of, you know, we were talking earlier about how idiosyncratic the, you know, into any kind of like intimate, intense, like love relationship is. And I think what it is a lot is those kind of sort of some of that like nature, and like you've got the inherent nature of these two people, and they're just kind of, when they come together, something weird happens that's not quite either of them, right? It's like you create like a dynamic that nobody really has control over. Yeah.
That's cool.
Even if you think as a parent that you should be controlling it or steering it in a certain way.
Anyone else? Excellent. Alexis, congratulations.
Thank you so
This is a
much.
beautiful book. It was a pleasure to talk with you and a pleasure to read your book. I urge you guys to get it if you haven't yet.
Nina, thank you so much. This
Oh,
was
yeah.
like such a fun conversation.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. And thank you to the Booksmith,
Yeah.
as always.
Thank you so much.